There were moments during the Second World War when the world hung by a thread. Decisions made in a whisper. Gunshots that ignited continents. Cities erased in the blink of an eye. What you are about to hear are not just battles. They are the moments in which the world changed without anyone being able to stop it. The shot on the Dirschau Bridge. The dawn of the 1st of September, 1939, did not bring with it great signs of a storm. The sky over Prussia was thick and gray, as if the day refused to rise completely. Along the Vistula, the air held that tense stillness that precedes irrevocable decisions. And in the heart of that false calm, at the edge of the small but strategic Dirschau Bridge, known today as Chew, in present-day Poland, a group of men awaited an order that should never have been given. What happened in those early hours of the conflict has been overshadowed by the more cinematic accounts of the bombing of Westerplatte, or the relentless advance of the Panzer divisions. But the Dirschau Bridge holds enormous symbolic and strategic weight. There were no large divisions or decorated generals there. Instead, there were engineers, saboteurs, railway workers, and a surgical plan whose precision had to be executed within minutes. Just a few gunshots and carefully measured explosions were enough to trigger the mechanism of a world war. The objective was simple and brutal: to capture the railway bridge over the Vistula intact, to guarantee the immediate connection between East Prussia and the rest of the Third Reich. It was an essential point for the logistics of German military movements, especially since interwar Poland split the Reich in two, and the so-called Polish Corridor represented a geographical and political obstacle that Hitler was no longer willing to tolerate. The plan that had been drawn up under the code name Fall Weiss, White Case, included dozens of simultaneous maneuvers, but few were as risky as the seizure of the Dirschau Bridge. The Germans could not bomb it, could not simply destroy it, because they needed it intact. And the Poles, of course, knew this. That is why, in the days before, they had placed explosive charges to blow it up if any occupation attempt was detected. What no one expected was the audacity, the coldness, and the precision with which the sabotage would unfold. At 4:30 in the morning, just as the sky began to reveal its first dull glow, a group of saboteurs disguised as railway workers crossed the bridge from the German side. They carried tools, fake documents, and most importantly, specific orders. Their mission was to neutralize the Polish guards before they could activate the detonation mechanism. What happened next is part of military reports, but also of detailed reconstructions made by historians who have traced the steps lost in the fog of the beginning of the conflict. The first gunshots were heard before the church bells announced the dawn. They were sharp, quick, and decisive. A Polish sentry fell, struck by a bullet in the neck, just as he tried to turn toward the metal structure containing the detonators. Within seconds, the German group had taken control of the electric mechanisms that could destroy the bridge. They had achieved the unthinkable, to stop time for a few minutes. But not long enough. One of the Polish officers, located in a more distant watchtower, immediately understood what was happening, and without waiting for orders from above, manually activated the explosive charges. He did not manage to destroy the entire structure, but he did cause critical damage to the central pillars. The armored train following behind, loaded with German troops ready to cross into Poland, had to stop abruptly, and with that, the master plan lost its perfect synchronization. Those minutes, those decisions made by individuals in nameless places, set the tone for what was to come. The Dirschau Bridge did not fall completely into German hands, but it was not completely destroyed either. Its structure partially collapsed, forcing the troops to seek alternative routes and slowing down the advance in that sector. It was not a Polish victory, but it was an unexpected obstacle. And if anything became clear from that dawn forward, it was that the war would not follow the exact script that the Reich's strategists had designed. Declassified documents years later, both from Polish archives and German sources, agree on one fact. Dirschau was one of the first examples of how the most carefully measured plans can falter in the face of the desperate improvisation of defenders. German military engineers had calculated that they would have the bridge operational within hours, but it took them days to secure the area and weeks to repair it. In the European theater of war, that was an eternity. What is fascinating about this story is not only the tactical movements, but the people involved. One of the German saboteurs, Friedrich K., wrote years later in his personal diary that, "In that moment, as I took control of the electric cables, I did not feel that a war was beginning. I felt that I was executing a choreography I had rehearsed to the point of obsession." That phrase, so simple and so chilling, precisely illustrates the kind of mindset with which Germany designed its blitzkrieg. Every piece had to fit. Every movement had to coincide with another at an exact point on the map and in time. And yet, even the most perfect choreographies can stumble upon an act of intuition. Many years later, when Soviet archives began to be made public, reports emerged suggesting that Stalin already knew something was going to happen in that area. Not precisely, but with enough information to send spies to monitor German movements near the bridge. Some theorists even claim that one of the German saboteurs was denounced by a Soviet source days before the attack, but the report did not reach Polish officials in time. This line of investigation has been the subject of much debate, and although there is no conclusive evidence, the fact that the bridge was not taken intact remains an anomaly within the German plan. The Dirschau Bridge does not appear in most documentaries about the Second World War. It is a footnote, a line lost among columns of tanks and bombers. But it was there, on that steel structure stretched over the Vistula, where the timeline of Europe broke for the first time. Because it is one thing to plan an invasion, and quite another to set in motion the bloody mechanism of history. The minutes in which the charges were activated, in which the first bullet was fired, in which a Polish soldier decided to act without orders, did not just define a geographical point, but revealed the fragility of empires in the face of human decision. It was not a great battle. There were not thousands of deaths. But it was, without a doubt, one of the most decisive moments in a war that was about to devour the entire world. And it all began with a solitary gunshot on a bridge without glory before the dawn had broken. The 90 Minutes of Westerplatte. History remembers Westerplatte as the place where everything began, the first official clash between German and Polish forces in the Second World War. But what many ignore is that during the first 90 minutes of that confrontation, a battle was fought that was as unequal as it was decisive, an episode that could well be considered one of the most heroic acts of the 20th century. Because in that compressed fragment of time, while the world was just beginning to wake up, a small Polish detachment resisted an attack designed to annihilate them within minutes, and they did so with a determination that still baffles strategists to this day. Westerplatte was a strip of land surrounded by water on three sides, a fortified and discreetly militarized pier located in the free port of the free city of Danzig, today known as Gdańsk. It was not a massive base, nor a defensive stronghold of epic proportions. It housed just over 200 Polish soldiers, poorly armed in comparison to the might of the Wehrmacht. The site had been under tension for months, but no one imagined it would be the ignition point of the most devastating conflict in history. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had arrived days earlier under the pretense of a diplomatic visit, opened direct fire on Westerplatte. The thunder was so deafening that it shattered windows in the nearby neighborhoods of Danzig. It was not a warning shot, nor a shot meant to intimidate. It was a meticulous bombardment, planned to completely demolish Polish defenses in a matter of minutes. The attack lasted exactly 7 minutes. In that brief span of time, the battleship fired more than 30 large-caliber shells, each capable of destroying an entire bunker. But when that first act ended, expecting to find smoldering ruins and bodies among the rubble. What they encountered instead was silence. A tense silence, almost insulting. The Polish garrison was not only still alive, it was ready to fight back. In those moments of uncertainty, when the smoke had not yet fully cleared, the Germans launched their next move. A ground assault force, made up of elite units trained for this kind of rapid operation, crossed the canal that separated the battleship from the dock. Their objective was clear and direct: breach the inner defenses, take control of the military depot, and declare the mission a success before sunrise. But here is where the true legend begins. The Polish defense had anticipated something of the sort. Over the previous months, under the command of Major Henryk Sucharski, they had built bunkers, hidden trenches among the trees, machine gun nests camouflaged in the vegetation, and even improvised explosive traps. It was not a traditional fortress. It was a maze of resistance, designed to delay any incursion for as long as possible. What no one, not even the defenders themselves, could foresee was that this defense would hold longer than logic allowed. When the Germans advanced, they did so with confidence, certain that the bombardment had destroyed any ability to respond. And then came the first miracle of Westerplatte. The Polish machine guns, silent during the naval attack, came to life with surgical precision. The fire was concentrated, precise, and deadly. The first German units were annihilated within minutes. A perfect ambush, born of patience and cold blood. There were no shouts or boasts, only gunfire, short, lethal bursts that turned the advance into a bloody chaos. In the following 90 minutes, the battle turned into a violent dance between two ways of understanding war. On one side, the overwhelming, mechanized, and numerous power of the German army. On the other, the silent stubbornness of a handful of soldiers who refused to fall. The Germans, baffled by the initial resistance, tried different routes, changed their formations, used flamethrowers, grenades, even additional artillery from land positions. But Westerplatte did not yield. Every time a breach seemed to open, resistance would rise from some hidden corner, as if the place itself had decided not to surrender. The chronicles describing those first moments speak of a dense atmosphere, filled with smoke, disturbed earth, and the smell of hot metal. The vegetation burned in some areas, while others remained in shadow, hiding the defenders like ghosts in a jungle of concrete. Major Sucharski, wounded in the first hours, was temporarily replaced by his second-in-command, Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski, who maintained the morale of the detachment with a composure that few officers could have managed under such conditions. There was no possibility of reinforcements. There was no hope of evacuation. And yet, not a single Polish soldier abandoned his post. One of the most curious aspects of this episode is that the German attackers, accustomed to lightning-fast operations, began to panic when their initial tactics failed. Several later reports show that the German officers had deeply underestimated the Polish state of preparation. The commander of the Schleswig-Holstein, Gustav Kleikamp, was forced to order a second naval bombardment before 7 in the morning, something not included in the original plan. But even after that renewed rain of shells, the defense remained firm. The Germans could not take Westerplatte that day, nor the next. In fact, the battle lasted a full 7 days. But it was those first 90 minutes that set the tone for the resistance. It was those 90 minutes that showed the Germans this war would not be won by technical superiority alone. That on the other side of every trench, there could be an enemy willing to die before retreating. The symbolic impact was enormous. From London to Moscow, through Paris and Stockholm, reports of the unexpected Polish resistance began to circulate with astonishment. The myth was born in real time. And although Poland was being crushed from the west by Germany and from the east by the Soviet Union, the tale of Westerplatte served as a spark of dignity in the midst of disaster. Decades later, when secret archives were opened and survivors began to speak, details emerged that turned this episode into an intimate epic. The Polish soldiers, many of them barely of age, spent hours without food or water, moving between positions under constant fire, bandaging their comrades with torn shirts, using weapons captured from the enemy. Some died without anyone knowing until the siege ended. Others, gravely wounded, refused evacuation in order not to weaken the defensive line. Today, on the site where it all happened, stands a sober monument of gray stone facing the Baltic Sea. There, every 1st of September, a siren sounds at 4:45 in the morning. And although the world has changed, and war is no longer a near nightmare for many, the echo of those first shots still lives on. Because in those 90 minutes of Westerplatte, more than a battle was condensed. The true character of a nation was revealed, as well as the human capacity to resist, even when all seems lost. The ambush at the Meuse River. When speaking of the fall of France in the Second World War, most accounts point to the inevitable tragedy of a nation unprepared to face modern warfare. The Maginot Line is remembered, a wall of concrete and steel that seemed impregnable. Yet the Germans bypassed it with the ease of someone stepping around a stone in the road. The rapid advance of the panzers is also mentioned, along with the astonishing speed with which the Third Reich shattered French resistance. However, very few understand that this vertiginous collapse began with millimetric precision at a very specific place and time. During an operation lasting barely 3 hours on the banks of the Meuse River, on the morning of May 12, 1940. The Meuse River flows like a deep artery between wooded hills and uneven terrain that, in times of peace, seemed designed for a postcard of a tranquil Europe. But during those spring days, the Meuse was a natural barrier that French strategists considered vital to contain the German advance. The defenses in that region were not as dense as those along the Maginot Line, but they were deemed sufficient. Regular units, artillery, engineers, and a surveillance network that, on paper, should have detected any crossing hours in advance. What happened, however, was a cruel lesson in the difference between planning and execution. General Heinz Guderian, one of the most decisive architects of the Blitzkrieg, understood better than anyone that victory did not lie in brute force, but in surprise. In speed, in absolute synchronization between units, even at the cost of centralized communication. What he planned in the Sedan region was not simply a forced river crossing, it was an ambush disguised as a frontal assault, designed to break not only physical defenses but the spirit of an entire defensive line. The Germans had been advancing from Luxembourg, moving through the Ardennes, a mountainous and dense terrain that the French deemed impassable for a mechanized force. That misjudgment was catastrophic. For days, the panzer divisions had moved along secondary roads, avoiding reconnaissance points, advancing at night or under the cover of dense and timely fog. When they reached the Meuse, they did so silently, and they did so quickly. Unlike the French, who were still thinking in terms of fixed defensive positions, the Germans had no intention of digging in. They wanted to cross and break the front. The operation began at dawn, just as the mist over the water still made it difficult to see clearly what was happening on the opposite bank. German soldiers deployed inflatable assault boats and built makeshift floating walkways, all in a matter of minutes. The heavy artillery, perfectly synchronized, rained down on the French positions with a precision many attribute to months of prior aerial reconnaissance. The defensive units were literally shaken before they could respond, and by the time they tried to reorganize, it was already too late. During those first 3 hours, the German units did not merely cross the river. What they executed was a flanking maneuver. While some soldiers secured the riverbank and advanced toward the heights of Sedan, others took lateral routes, eliminated observation points, and cut communication lines. Telephone lines were rendered useless. Radio messages became confusing. French officers located further back began receiving contradictory reports. Some spoke of minor skirmishes, others of a successful crossing. No one grasped the real magnitude of what was happening. That confusion was the true weapon of the attack. The accounts of the surviving French soldiers who managed to escape the area describe a rapid, almost abstract hell. Tracer bullets streaking through the sky without a clear direction, explosions that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and tanks emerging from the forest shadows as if part of a nightmare. Some spoke of seeing German soldiers move like organized shadows, executing cover and advance maneuvers with a discipline that seemed inhuman. Others simply could not articulate more than a single image, the moment they realized they were completely surrounded. What is extraordinary about this ambush is that it was designed to be irreversible from the very first minute. Guderian knew it. If they crossed successfully and took the hills above the Meuse, the French would not be able to counterattack effectively. From that elevated position, German artillery would dominate the access points, and the infantry would enjoy visual superiority. And so it was. In less than 3 hours, the defenders were overwhelmed. The retreat routes collapsed, and reinforcement attempts paralyzed by chaos. One French unit, the 55th Infantry Regiment, was practically annihilated while trying to retreat inland. Its officers failed to coordinate the withdrawal. In some cases, they ended up firing on their own comrades, mistaking uniforms under the rain of dust and shrapnel. That scene was described by a British observer as the moment when France's spine broke with an inaudible but definitive snap. After the crossing, the Germans did not stop. They did not take a breath. They did not secure positions. They kept advancing like a knife through soft flesh, using the open routes to deepen their attack westward, surrounding cities before they could prepare, and dividing enemy armies with terrifying efficiency. The orders were clear. Avoid unnecessary combat, move quickly, do not allow the enemy to recover. What occurred at the Meuse River during those 3 hours was more than a successful crossing. It was a strategic humiliation, a blow to the heart of a military doctrine that believed wars were still fought at the pace of heavy artillery and trenches. France never recovered from the psychological impact of that maneuver. In less than 6 weeks, Paris fell. And although multiple factors contributed to that outcome, everything can be traced back to the moment when German panzers emerged from the hills above Sedan, like an unexpected thunderclap. Many years later, in interviews given after the end of the war, several German officers agreed on a key point. The crossing of the Meuse was not only a military victory, it was an act of faith in a new way of waging war, a style that dispensed with formalism, with the code of honor between armies, and instead relied on speed, confusion, and the psychological collapse of the enemy. What happened there can be summarized in maps and dates, but it can also be understood as the birth of a doctrine that forever transformed the concept of combat. The Meuse River is still there. Its waters flow quietly, as if that midday of fire had never happened. But beneath the serene surface, in the dormant memory of its banks, the echo still resonates, of hurried footsteps, of engines that never stopped, of shouted orders no one could carry out, and of the certainty that in that fragment of time, between boats, bombs, and smoke, the fate of a nation was sealed. The last flight over Dunkirk. When British war archives began to be declassified in the decades following the conflict, there was a group of reports which, though small and brief in length, stood out for their emotional density. They were transcripts of radio communications between Royal Air Force squadrons during the evacuation of Dunkirk. In those broken transmissions, full of static noise, something was perceived that went beyond strategy or technique. A restrained tone, an urgency that was not always verbal, but that seeped between word and word, between code and coordinate. They were messages from men who knew their mission was counted in minutes. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, while the Allied troops awaited their evacuation on the beaches of Dunkirk under constant artillery fire and German bombings, the sky became the stage of a parallel battle, almost invisible to those who did not look up. A battle that, in its most intense moments, depended on the courage of a few pilots who flew too low, too far, and often with no chance of return. Dunkirk was a retreat disguised as a miracle. Operation Dynamo, as it was named, did not begin as a heroic rescue plan, but as a last resort in the face of imminent collapse. The Germans had surrounded the British and French forces on the coast, cutting off all land routes. The only way out left was the sea. What seemed inevitable was a massacre. Nearly 400,000 souls were trapped in an ever-shrinking space, waiting for an improvised fleet of civilian and military vessels to cross the English Channel. The Luftwaffe had precise orders to prevent that evacuation at all costs. They bombed the docks, strafed the beaches, attacked any boat that dared approach. In that scenario, every British flight carried the weight of a decision with no return. The last flight referred to in this episode took place on the afternoon of June 3rd, when most of the British forces had already been evacuated, and mainly French soldiers remained on land. The Royal Air Force, which had suffered heavy losses in the previous days, was exhausted, decimated, and at the limit of its logistical capacity. Many of the squadrons operated from improvised bases, with damaged planes, no spare parts, and pilots who had not slept in days. But one final wave of air cover was needed. A distraction strong enough so that the remaining boats could load the stragglers without being annihilated by the German fighters and bombers still flying over the area. That day, from a base in southern England, Squadron Number 42 took off, made up of Spitfires and Hurricanes, in one of the most dangerous missions of the entire operation. They had no fuel for extensive maneuvers, and they knew the return would be more uncertain than ever. They flew under adverse conditions, with the French coast fully exposed to enemy observation. Despite that, there were no doubts or hesitations. In the flight records, one can simply read, "Takeoff authorized. Final cover mission. Objective. Protect evacuation zone. High risk. No guarantees." Crossing the channel under those circumstances was a trial of steel. The pilots knew the German fighters were already waiting for them. What they faced upon arrival was a sky crossed by Heinkel bombers, escorted by Messerschmitts that dove like blades onto the British formation. The air battle that broke out over the next few minutes was fierce, chaotic, and extremely violent. British radars recorded the loss of at least 7 of their own aircraft in barely 20 minutes. Some pilots managed to eject and fell into the sea, but most died without leaving more trace than a cut-off radio signal and a name crossed out in the logbook. And yet, the objective was achieved. During that brief interval in which the skies turned into a hell of crossfire, several ships managed to approach the coast, pick up the last soldiers, and retreat before the bombers returned in a new wave. What for many was just another battle in the air, for those on the ground meant the difference between dying trapped and returning alive to British soil. There is a story that has survived on the margins of official documents. It does not appear in strategic reports, but it has been repeated by veterans and confirmed by personal letters found years later. It is the story of Lieutenant Edward Teddy Moffat, one of the pilots of that final flight. Moffat flew a slightly damaged Spitfire, which he himself had nicknamed Agnes in honor of his mother. During the combat, he managed to shoot down 2 German fighters before being hit. Instead of trying to recross the channel with a dying engine, he turned his plane toward a formation of bombers and crashed into one of them, causing an explosion that scattered the others. None of the pilots survived. His act was recorded in a fragment of transmission that someone on the ground managed to catch. No brakes left. Let this count for something. Stories like Moffat's are not uncommon in war narratives, but what sets Dunkirk apart is the awareness of the men who took part in that final phase. None expected medals, nor recognition, not even the certainty that their action would make a difference. They did it because someone had to, because they knew that every second gained in the air was one more chance for someone who, on the sands of that endless beach, looked to the sky in desperation. The last flight over Dunkirk was not a tactical victory, nor a perfect operation. It was, in any case, an urgent intervention on the very edge of collapse. It was a way to close the circle of the retreat with dignity, ensuring that the last to leave did not do so under direct fire, but under a cover of British wings ready to burn if necessary. Today, in the memorials of Dunkirk, there are plaques with the names of the fallen on land, at sea, and in the air. But often those who visit these places do not realize that what defined the evacuation was not only the bravery of the soldiers waiting for their turn to board a boat, but also the almost invisible sacrifice of those who flew for the last time knowing the sky was a killing field from which they would not return. In the popular imagination, Operation Dynamo has become a symbol of resistance, ingenuity, and hope. But it should not be forgotten that its conclusion depended on an act of collective courage sustained for hours that felt like days. In those final missions, as the horizon turned red from the fire of anti-aircraft batteries, a handful of pilots wrote with their lives the epilogue of a story that almost ended in total tragedy. The last flight over Dunkirk did not save an entire nation, but it preserved the seed that would later grow in the efforts of an entire generation. And in that brief passage between sky and sea lies one of the purest acts of human sacrifice amid the horror of war. The Night of Flames in Coventry, the night of November 14, 1940, began with an unsettling calm. In Coventry, an industrial city in the heart of England, people were closing shops early, some still listening to radio reports about air raids over London, and families were gathering for dinner as the sky took on that leaden tone that precedes uncertainty. On the surface, it was just another wartime evening, but the air carried that inexplicable heaviness that heralds tragedy. As if the walls, the streets, the very trees sensed what was coming. At 7 o'clock, the sirens began to wail, and within minutes, Coventry was transformed into a hell of fire, steel, and rubble. What happened that night was not just another bombing. It was a methodical execution, calculated with almost mathematical precision. The German Luftwaffe, under the direct orders of Hermann Göring, had identified Coventry as the ideal target for a new type of attack, a lethal combination of explosive and incendiary bombs, dropped in a planned sequence to maximize destruction, not only of military facilities, but of the very soul of the city. In other words, the aim in Coventry was to turn aerial warfare into a tool of emotional devastation. The operation's codename was Mondschein Sonate, Moonlight Sonata, a cruel irony disguised as poetry. The first wave of planes arrived shortly after 7:15, dropping green flares that painted the city's rooftops with a ghostly glow. These flares were not attacks themselves, but markers, signals for the bomber formations that would follow. On the ground, people were only beginning to react. Some ran to underground shelters, others were still trying to shut windows, protect shop displays, cover what little they could save with blankets. But it was already too late. Soon after, the first explosive bombs began to fall. Their purpose was twofold: to rupture water pipes and destroy roads, making it harder for firefighters to respond. Then came the incendiaries, thousands of small magnesium and phosphorus charges that, upon explosion, released temperatures so high that even brick structures began to burn. The flames multiplied through each building, bouncing off shop windows, climbing the cathedral towers, merging with one another until the city center became a continuous bonfire. In less than 2 hours, Coventry's historic core ceased to exist. St. Michael's Cathedral, built in the 14th century, fell victim to the fire around 10 o'clock. The images of its collapse, captured the next day by British military photographers, became one of the most bitter symbols of the war. A building that had survived plagues, civil conflict, and the brutal passage of time, reduced to ashes by the arrogance of modern warfare. The partially preserved stone altar emerged from the ruins like a remnant of what was once faith, now wrapped in the smoke of despair. In the skies, British fighters attempted to intercept the German bombers, but the numerical superiority was overwhelming. More than 500 enemy aircraft crossed the English sky that night, unleashing their fury upon a city that, until then, had lived under the illusion that the worst attacks were reserved for London. The Royal Air Force, overstretched and under-resourced, could do little. anti-aircraft defenses gave everything they had, but even their best efforts were futile against an offensive designed with cold calculation and executed with near-clinical efficiency. Firefighters worked tirelessly, but they faced an enemy that seemed endless. The incendiary bombs not only destroyed buildings, they embedded themselves in roofs, patios, and pipes, then exploded after a delay, trapping those who tried to extinguish the flames. The German strategy had considered every detail. Destroy the logistics first, then the structure, and finally, morale. And they succeeded. Coventry burned for 11 uninterrupted hours. The flames could be seen from over 100 kilometers away. There are testimonies from within the underground shelters that chill the blood. Entire families trapped beneath concrete slabs listened as the world collapsed above them without knowing if they would make it out alive. Some managed to record sounds, moans, the constant trembling of walls, the whistling of bombs falling every few seconds. An 11-year-old girl, interviewed years later, recalled how her mother sang to mask the noise and keep her children from breaking down. She said, "The sky was falling, and Mom sang like she could hold it up with her voice." On the morning of November 15th, when the smoke began to clear, what remained looked like a world after the end. More than 70,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. Nearly 900 people were killed, and several hundred more disappeared among the rubble, their bodies never recovered. The factories, the schools, the hospitals, the community centers, everything had been hit. But the most terrifying part was not the scale of the destruction. It was its nature. Coventry became the first testing ground of a systematic war against cities, and that marked a before and after. There is one aspect of the attack that remains controversial, shrouded in the secrecy of state. Some historians argue that the British government, through the Ultra Project and the breaking of the Enigma Code, knew the attack on Coventry was imminent, but chose not to act to stop it. The theory claims that intercepting the bombing would have revealed to the Germans that their communications had been compromised. Had they known, they would have changed their encryption methods, and the British strategic advantage would have vanished. Churchill, according to this version, made the decision to sacrifice Coventry to protect the secret. It is a claim difficult to prove, but the mere possibility adds an even darker layer to that night. After the attack, the word Coventrized began appearing in German documents as a synonym for utterly and mercilessly destroyed. And yet, Coventry rose again. Not immediately, not without pain. But it did. The new cathedral was built next to the ruins of the old one, not to erase them, but to remember them, so that each charred stone would keep speaking, so that every visitor could understand that here, one night, fire consumed not only buildings, but transformed the very idea of what it meant to be safe. Today, when one walks the streets of Coventry, one can feel the invisible weight of that night, not in the air, now clean, nor in the facades, now rebuilt, but in the gestures of those who grew up with the memory of what it meant to lose everything. Because that night, beyond the smoke, beyond the fire, what broke was trust. Trust that war still had rules. Trust that humanity would not cross certain lines. But it did. And the sound of that break still echoes like a rusted bell through the halls of history. The shadow over Moscow. Winter had arrived early, bringing with it a thick silence that blanketed the frozen fields like a shroud of death. For weeks, the wind had been blowing from the north with an ancient, almost biblical fury, and the snow piled up on the village rooftops with a speed that distorted the landscape every night. Moscow, in December of 1941, was no longer a city. It was a besieged fortress, a wounded beast resisting in the gloom, knowing that the final German offensive was underway and that there would be no room for further mistakes. Since the start of Operation Barbarossa in June of that same year, the troops of the Third Reich had advanced on Soviet soil with methodical determination. They crushed villages, dismantled defensive lines, and pushed the Red Army eastward with a speed that seemed unstoppable. Every kilometer conquered bore witness to a violence that no longer followed military logic. However, what Hitler and his high command had not foreseen was that the vastness of Russia could not be conquered as easily as a border could be broken. The men, the land, the climate, everything seemed to conspire in the same tone of brutal resistance. For weeks, the offensive toward Moscow had slowed. The panzer divisions, once invincible, were beginning to stall in the frozen mud and cut off supply lines, casualties of the territory's own vastness. The temperatures plummeted, and the German army, poorly equipped for the winter, began to feel it in gangrenous fingers, in engines that would not start, in boots that cracked apart on the frost. Yet the advance continued, and for the Soviets there was no margin for error. In the capital, as the offensive approached within 30 kilometers, the atmosphere was terrifyingly silent. Stalin, true to his style, refused to abandon the city, and with him remained the high command of the Kremlin. Propaganda insisted on heroic resistance, but in the dark corridors of the Soviet command, the reality was much more fragile. Moscow could fall within days, perhaps even within hours. On the front lines, the reports were increasingly alarming. Defensive units were exhausted, the number of deserters was rising, and the ammunition reserves were not sufficient to sustain a prolonged defense. It was then that something unexpected happened. In the midst of a critical situation, when everything seemed to be leaning toward surrender or catastrophe, on the 6th of December 1941, Stalin gave the order to launch a massive counterattack on the Western Front. That decision, which may seem logical today in hindsight, was at the time a suicidal gamble. The Red Army was decimated, disorganized, and deeply weakened. And yet, Stalin knew something the Germans did not. Weeks earlier, through his intelligence network in the Pacific, Stalin had received crucial information. The Japanese, who had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, had no intention of attacking from the east. This allowed him to move dozens of Siberian divisions to the Western Front without fear of a rear assault. These troops were no ordinary units. They were soldiers trained for winter combat, hardened in extreme conditions, disciplined to the point of exhaustion. They arrived in silent trains, camouflaged in the snow, and were deployed without warning. The Germans, confident in Soviet weakness, never saw them coming. The counterattack began at dawn, with the temperature hovering around 30 degrees below zero. At that hour, the wind blew from the east with such fury that it was impossible to keep one's eyes open without protection. The German troops, exhausted after weeks of uninterrupted advance, were not prepared to withstand a frontal assault. Within hours, several of the most advanced sectors began to collapse. What had been a siege line turned into a disorderly retreat. Heavy machinery, frozen and out of fuel, was abandoned. The soldiers, hungry and poorly clothed, fell by the dozens without firing a single bullet. On that first day of the counterattack, a phenomenon occurred that would shape the rest of the campaign. For the first time, the Germans were retreating en masse. It was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a collapse. And the most unsettling part was that the Soviet advance was not based on numerical superiority or sophisticated weaponry, but on surgical planning executed by officers who knew every corner of the terrain, every forest, every bend of the river. Winter, which had once seemed like a curse to the Soviets, was now their most precise weapon. During 3 critical hours between 7 and 10 in the morning, the pressure on the German lines was so intense that the command of Army Group Center began to lose operational control. Radio communications were cut, intermediate command chains disintegrated, and gaps appeared in the defensive line that the Soviets exploited without mercy. The cavalry, in a move that seemed drawn from another century, played a key role, charging through routes impossible for motorized vehicles. The Siberian soldiers, dressed in white camouflage, slipped among the pines and fired with surgical precision. disappearing into the forest immediately after. That moment, that brief stretch of the morning of December 6th, was the hinge point of the entire Eastern Front. Not because the Germans were expelled from Moscow immediately, but because for the first time it became clear that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. The German machine, feared by all of Europe, had found its limit. And that limit was the cold, the distance, the hunger, and the stubborn resistance of an army that had no choice left but to fight to the end. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet offensive continued, and the Germans were pushed back more than 200 kilometers to the west. Moscow, though still under threat, breathed for the first time in months. The citizens who had dug trenches with their hands, the children who had slept in improvised basements, the doctors who operated with frozen gloves, began to feel that the city would endure. The shadow that loomed over Moscow did not fully vanish, but it stopped advancing. Today, when one studies the course of the Second World War, that moment may seem small against the vastness of the conflict. But if observed carefully, if one examines the documents from both sides, the war bulletins, the maps, the testimonies, one discovers that in those 3 hours of controlled chaos, Moscow was saved, and with it, the possibility of a Soviet victory in the future. There are those who believe that history is written in great battles, in treaties signed beneath golden lamps, or in speeches recorded for posterity. But the truth is that, many times, it is defined in the white darkness of a frozen morning, between muffled gunfire and footsteps crunching on the snow, when a group of men, nearly invisible, decides that surrender is not an option. That was the shadow over Moscow. The moment when the city, on the brink of annihilation, learned how to resist. The dawn of Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the day began like any other morning on the island of Oahu, with the warmth of a sun just beginning to rise over the waters of the Pacific, slowly lighting the palm trees, the hangars, and the metallic decks of the battleships that slept in rows inside Pearl Harbor Bay. The ocean breeze carried a salty smell that blended with that of fuel and steel, while the sailors of the United States Navy began their day unaware that in less than an hour, the entire course of the 20th century would be changed forever. At that moment, Pearl Harbor represented the jewel of the United States naval power in the Pacific. It was a formidable base, filled with strategic structures, arsenals, warships, and military personnel, located in what many still considered a geographical paradise. At first glance, it was a modern fortress, safe in its oceanic isolation, far from the battlefields already consuming Europe and Asia. But that feeling of invulnerability would soon turn into a deadly trap. What was about to happen had been planned for months with the precision of a surgical operation. In Tokyo, the Japanese military leadership had made the decision to break the strategic balance of the region with a preemptive strike that would paralyze the American fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the main architect of the offensive, clearly understood that the only way to move forward with Japan's imperial expansion without immediate United States intervention was to take out, at least temporarily, the backbone of its maritime power. The plan was not simply to attack, it was to strike without warning, with the precision of an irreversible sentence. The Japanese strike fleet, made up of 6 aircraft carriers escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, sailed for days in complete radio silence, enveloped by the immensity of the Pacific, hidden under the pretense of maneuvers north of Japan. Each of the carriers transported squadrons of fighter planes, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, trained to exhaustion for a mission that had to be executed in just 2 waves, and in such a brief time that, if all went according to plan, the attacked base would barely have time to react. At 6 o'clock in the morning, local time, the first attack groups took off from the decks. They were just over 180 aircraft flying at low altitude, divided by function and target. Some were to neutralize the airfields, others the ships, and a third group was tasked with the hangars and anti-aircraft defenses. The sky was clear, without clouds to reveal the arrival of death, and the sea calm reflected the dark silhouettes of the planes gliding like specters over the waves. At 7:55, the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The initial impact was followed by a sequence that in just a matter of minutes turned the base into an apocalyptic scene. The battleship USS Arizona, struck by a bomb that penetrated its deck and detonated in the ammunition hold, exploded with such force that the blast was heard several kilometers away. A column of fire and black smoke rose into the sky, marking the start of an attack as brutal as it was unexpected. Of the 1,500 crew members aboard, more than 1,100 died instantly, trapped in compartments flooding with water as the ship broke in two. Japanese fighter planes attacked in dives, launching torpedoes with devastating precision. American anti-aircraft defenses barely reacted at first. Many gunners, caught in their quarters, ran barefoot to the weapons, some firing without even knowing exactly what they were shooting at. The USS Oklahoma, also hit by torpedoes, slowly capsized. Dozens of sailors were trapped in the hull, pounding desperately on the metal from inside as the water rose until the sound stopped. Within 15 minutes of the beginning of the attack, there were already hundreds of dead and wounded. The hangars were burning, the runways were smoking craters, and the smoke made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Chaos was absolute. And yet, the second wave had not yet begun. At 8:40, the Japanese returned with a second attack. This time, the targets were more specific. Radar stations, headquarters, fuel depots. They wanted to leave no chance of immediate recovery. It was a total operation. And the most sinister part of all was that, at the same time, Japanese diplomats in Washington were still engaged in talks with the State Department, while a statement was being drafted to formally break off relations just minutes after the bombing began. In the span of 90 minutes, the base was paralyzed. 8 battleships were hit. 4 were sunk. More than 300 aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Human casualties exceeded 2,400 dead. It was a surgical strike, cold, executed with the efficiency that only nationalist fanaticism can justify. And yet, something did not go as expected. The Japanese mission, which aimed to completely neutralize the United States fleet, made a miscalculation. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. By sheer coincidence, or by fortune according to some accounts, the most important ships in the fleet were on maneuvers away from the base. That detail, seemingly minor, would prove decisive in the months to come. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would be the protagonists of the new era of naval warfare. And their survival prevented the Pacific from falling completely into Japanese hands. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military event. It was a symbol. The United States, until then divided in its stance on the war, united with unprecedented speed. The following day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress and delivered one of the most remembered speeches in contemporary history, calling that day a date which will live in infamy. The response was immediate, a formal declaration of war against Japan, and days later, against Germany and Italy as well. The conflict that had until then consumed Europe and Asia became truly global. But there is another, less mentioned and darker aspect that continues to fuel theories and suspicions. Some researchers, based on documents leaked decades later, claim that high-ranking members of the American government had indications that an attack was imminent, although they did not know where or when it would happen. It has been suggested that Roosevelt, seeking justification to enter the war, allowed a certain tactical passivity, trusting that the limited sacrifice of a remote base would serve as a catalyst for a stronger national commitment. The evidence in that sense is incomplete, fragmented, and largely speculative, but the persistence of doubt adds a layer of ambiguity to a tragedy that, on the surface, seemed crystal clear. What is certain is that Pearl Harbor marked a point of no return. After that dawn, the war changed in pace, tone, and scale. The Pacific Ocean became the new stage for a total conflict, where distances were immense and violence increasingly impersonal. That Sunday, in a corner of Hawaii, the spark was lit that would draw millions into a storm from which few would emerge unscathed. And though the years pass and testimonies fade with time, the image of the battleships in flames, of the smoke rising in spirals, and of the sky torn by the roar of engines will remain one of the most haunting moments of the century. A dawn stained red where the world, unknowingly, awoke to a new era of destruction. The Sands of Midway, June 4th, 1942. Dawned over the Midway Atoll with a deceptive silence. At first glance, those small islands surrounded by reefs seemed completely untouched by the roar of the war that engulfed the world. The turquoise waters of the Pacific stretched out calmly, as if nothing could disturb them. But that apparent serenity was only the surface of a tension that had been building for weeks. Because in that remote point on the map, thousands of kilometers northwest of Hawaii, the fate of the Pacific was about to be decided. And what unfolded in a matter of hours would become one of the most decisive and enigmatic battles of the entire conflict. Midway was not important for its size, but for its location. Strategically positioned between the United States and Asia, it represented a natural gateway to project power over the Central Pacific. And no one understood that better than Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that first strike, Japan sought to consolidate its maritime dominance before the United States could recover. The plan was bold. Lure what remained of the U.S. fleet into an ambush near Midway, completely destroy it, and thus open the path toward a negotiated peace from a position of absolute supremacy. The operation, therefore, was designed with an extremely precise military choreography. 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would form the heart of the attack. They would be escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines in a massive deployment. The logic was simple. Japan had the initiative, the experience, and naval superiority. But what Yamamoto did not know was that his enemy already knew the plan. In the months leading up to the battle, U.S. Navy intelligence cryptographers had succeeded in deciphering key parts of the Japanese code JN-25. The discovery was so delicate that it had to be handled with absolute secrecy, even within the armed forces themselves. Through a clever stratagem that included sending a false message about a water shortage on Midway, the Americans confirmed that it was indeed the Japanese target. And with that information, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a daring decision: to organize an ambush against those who were planning an ambush. The battle, however, was not won solely through prior intelligence. It was won in the air over the course of 3 hours on the morning of June 4th, in which the balance of the Pacific shifted with almost unreal speed. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown positioned themselves northeast of the atoll, waiting for the perfect moment to launch their squadrons. It was a high-risk move. If the Japanese detected their position too soon, they could be wiped out with no chance of defense. But the element of surprise was on the American side, and that tipped the scales decisively. At 6:30 in the morning, the first Japanese planes began bombing Midway. The base resisted with difficulty but managed to remain operational. At 7, U.S. radar detected the approach of enemy forces. Several squadrons of torpedo bombers and dive bombers were launched into the air, many of them flying without escort. What followed was an act of desperate bravery. Waves of torpedo bombers like those of Squadron VT-8, who knew that their chances of survival were nearly zero, flew directly toward the Japanese carriers, facing anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters, without veering off course. They were annihilated. One after another, the torpedo bombers fell into the sea, leaving behind only trails of smoke and bubbles. Japanese resistance was fierce, and it seemed the ambush would fail. But amid that sacrifice, something unexpected happened. The torpedo attacks forced the Japanese carriers to keep their fighters at low altitude, away from the dive bombers approaching from a different direction. At 10:20, the American Dauntless bombers appeared over the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, and within minutes turned the battle into a disaster for Japan. The bombs fell with surgical precision. A single explosion on the Akagi was enough to disable it. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the fuel and ammunition waiting on deck. Officers tried to contain the flames, but it was futile. The same happened with the Kaga and the Soryu, whose hangars burst into uncontrollable flames. The scene, seen from above, was apocalyptic. 3 sea giants wrapped in columns of smoke with hundreds of sailors leaping desperately into the water to escape the burning hell. Japan's only hope rested in the hands of the Hiryu, which managed to launch a counterattack and hit the Yorktown, taking it out of action. But it was not enough. By the end of the day, the Hiryu was also located and destroyed. 4 aircraft carriers, the elite of the Imperial Navy, sank in less than 24 hours. And with them sank the illusion that Japan could dictate the rules of the conflict in the Pacific. Midway was much more than a naval battle. It was a rupture. The war no longer revolved around mighty battleships or direct clashes between aligned fleets. Supremacy was decided in the air, in the exact minutes when a pilot had to choose between aborting the mission or diving straight at the target, between veering off in the face of enemy fire or trusting the aim of a single bomb. What strategists had conceived over months collapsed in a span so short that many witnesses could not process it in real time. The mystery surrounding Midway is not only how such an absolute victory was achieved against a better armed enemy, but also the convergence of factors that seemed to align in an almost supernatural way. Prior intelligence, the courage of the pilots, the miscalculations of Japanese command, and the split-second decisions of anonymous men who, in the fog of combat, managed to change the fate of the world without even being sure they would live to tell the tale. Years later, many of the pilots who participated in Midway admitted that they did not understand the magnitude of their actions until much later. In the moment, it was all instinct, training, pure adrenaline. But what they left behind was a turning point that could never be repeated. From Midway onward, Japan would move to the defensive, and the United States, wounded after Pearl Harbor, would seize the initiative in the Pacific. Today, the Midway Atoll is little more than a shadow on the maps, an island of seabirds and reefs that holds beneath its waters the remains of sunken ships and the memories of a day that shattered the balance of power with a speed that seems more fitting for fiction than for history. But in those clear waters, among the rusted wreckage and the unbroken silence of the ocean floor, remains the trace of a moment when the fate of the world turned on the invisible axis of a battle that lasted only a few hours, but forever changed the course of the war. The Fury of Pavlov. The city of Stalingrad, in the autumn of 1942, was not just a battlefield. It was an open wound in the heart of Europe. From the air, German bombers saw an unrecognizable metropolis, crossed by columns of smoke, buildings turned into concrete skeletons, and a vast stretch of the Volga River that seemed like a corridor between 2 warring worlds. The ruins of the city formed a senseless labyrinth, a landscape of rubble and death where every square meter demanded blood. And amid that absolute desolation, a structure stood with almost unbelievable stubbornness, a simple 4-story apartment building, planted like a broken tooth facing January 9th Square. There, for weeks, a small group of Soviet soldiers resisted the German siege with a ferocity bordering on the mythic. History would remember it as Pavlov's house. But what happened there goes far beyond a traditional heroic tale. It is a tactical mystery, an anomaly within a campaign marked by excesses, horrors, and impossible numbers. Because the question that even today many analysts ask is not how the Soviet soldiers held out in that house, but why that position became a disproportionate symbol, revered as if it had been a miniature city. a fortress that absorbed all German fury without ever surrendering. The official history says the house was taken by a detachment led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov at the end of September 1942, as part of a local counteroffensive to halt the enemy advance toward the Volga. The building, with straight lines and a brick facade, was one of the few that still maintained a relatively solid structure in that sector of the front. From its windows, a strategic crossing was dominated, the square through which German tanks passed toward the river line. Apparently, it was just another point within the urban web that had become the epicenter of the battle. But what happened there defied all logic. As soon as the Soviets took the house, they began fortifying it as if it were the Kremlin. Within a few hours, they boarded up windows, mined entrances, installed machine guns on every floor, and dug tunnels connecting the building to other nearby resistance points. The orders were clear. Do not abandon the position under any circumstance. And so they did. For nearly 60 days, Pavlov's detachment, which at its strongest numbered 25 men, although at times there were fewer than a dozen, resisted a constant siege from German troops, who tried by every means to regain control of the building. What is perplexing is that the Germans seemed obsessed with that position. It has been documented that for weeks, the field artillery bombarded the building almost exclusively, as if it were a high-priority target. Infantry units launched direct, often suicidal attacks against the house's walls. Even tanks fired point-blank at the lower floors, trying to open breaches for commandos to enter. But the house held. And not only did it hold, it responded with relentless aggression. The men inside Pavlov's house fought with a discipline that seemed to surpass the limits of human endurance. They took turns shooting, sleeping, repairing destroyed walls, and resupplying at night through the tunnels connecting them to the rear. Some accounts speak of snipers hidden among the rubble, who knew exactly where to shoot to bring down enemy columns. Others mention that, despite the extreme cold, Pavlov forbade the use of blankets during the day to avoid visible movements from outside. Every gesture was calculated. Every bullet had a purpose. At the center of it all was him, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, whose figure has become almost mythical. A man of few words, with an angular face and hardened expression, Pavlov was not a hero by vocation. He was, like many others, a peasant turned soldier by the force of fate. But he had one quality that set him apart: an unbreakable will. The few letters he wrote during those days, mostly sent to his mother, did not speak of feats or glory. They spoke of cold, hunger, exhaustion, and duty. That word, repeated like a mantra, seems to have been the inner engine of his resistance. Now then, the mystery of Pavlov's house does not lie only in the story of its defense. What still generates debate among historians and military experts is the level of attention it received from the Germans. Why dedicate so many resources to an insignificant structure in a city that was burning entirely? Why insist over and over on taking it when there were multiple alternative routes toward the Volga? Some suggest that the house represented a psychological thorn in the side of the German advance, a persistent humiliation, a small daily defeat that undermined morale. Others believe its position actually interfered with enemy logistics, blocking key lines of sight and movements in that sector. There are even more speculative theories, fueled by later Soviet documents. It has been suggested that the house functioned as a clandestine command post, housing long-range radio teams used to coordinate Red Army movements in the Central District. According to this version, Sergeant Pavlov and his men were not just defenders but guardians of a vital intelligence node. This hypothesis has never been confirmed, but the mere fact it has been considered reveals the extent to which this small urban battle has become layered with meaning. What is certain is that the house resisted until the end. When Soviet forces definitively retook control of the sector in early 1943, Pavlov's house was still standing, burned inside, marked by artillery hits, but essentially intact. Some of the defenders were still there, with gaunt faces, ragged clothes, and rusty weapons, but with the look of those who had fulfilled their mission beyond what was demanded. Stalingrad was a symbol on many levels, of sacrifice, brutality, and tenacity. But within that symbol, Pavlov's house was an allegory itself. The idea that even the humblest structure can become an impregnable bastion if defended with the conviction of those who have no alternative left. Stalin himself, upon learning of the building's resistance, ordered it rebuilt as a monument to heroism. Today, at the exact place where a dozen men stopped the advance of one of the most powerful armies on the planet, stands a residential complex with a plaque commemorating that episode, like a whisper that has survived the roar of the cannons. And although time has covered the details with a patina of legend, Pavlov's fury remains alive in the memory of those who study the Second World War. Not as a sequence of grand decisions, but as a map of small acts of resistance that, added together, decided the course of history. Because sometimes, what changes the course of a war is not the size of the army, nor the strength of the weapons, but the stubbornness of a handful of men entrenched in a brick house, refusing to surrender when everything else has fallen. The Whisper Beneath the Sea, Operation Enigma. In the damp corridors of Bletchley Park, where the fog seemed to cling to the walls and the windows vibrated with the constant hum of running machines, there was a day when a group of people understood, without shouting, that the course of the war had just shifted in their favor. That moment, without gunfire, without blood, without stained uniforms, happened far from the battlefields, but had an impact as profound as any ground offensive. Because there, amidst cables, punch tapes, and diagrams pinned to the walls, the Allies managed to decipher one of the most complex parts of the Nazi war machine, the encrypted communication system known as Enigma. But before the brilliant minds of the British team could work their magic, there was a critical, decisive moment that did not happen on solid ground. It happened beneath the sea. To understand the magnitude of what was at stake, it is necessary to go back a few years and immerse oneself in the relentless logic of the Atlantic conflict. From the beginning of the war, the German submarines, the feared U-boats, became a constant threat to Allied convoys transporting supplies from America to Europe. They navigated invisibly beneath the ocean's surface, organized in packs, attacked by surprise, and disappeared as quickly as they emerged. They did this in part thanks to an overwhelming strategic advantage. Their communications were encrypted by a device that seemed unbreakable. The Enigma machine, used by the German Navy, was a marvel of cryptographic engineering, an artifact with multiple interchangeable rotors offering more than 150 trillion possible combinations. Each coded message was a literal enigma, a box locked with multiple locks that changed daily, even hourly. Without the exact key, the message's content became unreadable, a set of meaningless letters that no human logic could order. And that was precisely what made Enigma an invisible weapon, capable of coordinating operations on different fronts with deadly precision. Breaking that code was equivalent to reading the enemy's mind. But to do so required more than mathematical talent. It required luck, boldness, and a precise moment of opportunity. That moment arrived on May 9, 1941, in the middle of the North Atlantic, when the British destroyer HMS Bulldog managed to capture the German submarine, U-110. What should have been just another encounter between an escort ship and a convoy hunter turned, through a series of unpredictable decisions, into one of the most valuable intelligence operations of the entire conflict. The U-110 had been detected and attacked with depth charges. Severely damaged, it surfaced, and its crew began evacuation. The usual protocol in such cases was to activate self-destruction measures, which included sinking the submarine and destroying any classified equipment on board. But something failed in that chain. Perhaps it was fear, haste, or simply human error. The truth is that when the British boarded the submarine, they discovered the unthinkable. The Enigma machine was intact. That discovery was not immediate. The first to enter the partially submerged hull of the U-110 were naval intelligence technicians and officers, trained to secure any valuable object within minutes before the submarine sank completely. They worked silently, under unbearable tension, knowing every second counted. They found documents, code tables, operation manuals, and, in a cramped and stifling communications room, the Enigma machine. They carefully transported it back to the Bulldog without making the discovery public. What happened afterward remained an absolute secret for years. So secret, in fact, that even many crew members of the ship that made the capture never knew what had truly happened that afternoon. The operation was so delicate that Churchill personally ordered the incident not be disclosed. The Germans had to continue believing their code was secure and therefore keep using it. The machine, along with the recovered documents, was quietly sent to Bletchley Park. There, cryptographers led by Alan Turing and a team of discreet geniuses worked on that material like modern alchemists, not seeking gold, but the internal structures of an encrypted language that could cost, or save, millions of lives. The impact of that capture was immediate, though invisible. Thanks to direct access to the Naval Enigma's physical configuration, analysts built more precise simulations of the device and adjusted their own deciphering machines, known as bombs. Over time, this allowed reading enemy messages with a delay of only a few hours. On the battlefield, this translated into the ability to avoid ambushes, protect crucial convoys, and respond to Kriegsmarine movements with a speed previously impossible. Every decrypted message was a drop of advantage in a sea of uncertainty. But the most unsettling aspect of this episode is the paradox it contains. Modern war, with all its industrial and technological brutality, was decided at many key moments by individual, almost intimate decisions. In this case, it was a German submariner who forgot to activate the self-destruct system, a British captain who chose to board rather than sink the vessel, and a handful of analysts who could see beyond the symbols. The whisper beneath the sea, that tiny moment when the machine was rescued from the belly of the U-110, set off a chain of consequences that no one could have fully predicted. For decades, this operation was kept under the strictest secrecy. Not even at the war's end was it made public. The reason was strategic. The Allies wanted to preserve the illusion that they had won by brute force and moral superiority, not by intercepting and reading every enemy move. Only in the 1970s, when documents began to be declassified, was the full story reconstructed, and the true value of that submarine capture understood. Today, in naval museums and the exhibition halls of Bletchley Park, one of the Enigma machines rescued from the sea can be seen, protected behind glass, accompanied by newspaper clippings from the time, technical diagrams, and a statement as sober as it is striking. This machine shortened the war by at least 2 years. And if one stops in front of it, studies it carefully, it is possible to imagine it still humming, as if the whispers of the Atlantic remained locked within its structure, as if the orders that once traveled between its keys still echoed beneath the surface of time. Because that was Operation Enigma, an act of subtle intelligence, hidden beneath layers of codes and sailors, unaware that what they were doing would change history. A victory without explosions, without flags, without anthems. Just the muffled sound of a machine turning in the shadows, while someone on the other side of the world, unknowingly, began to lose the war. Rommel's Three Strikes. In the sands of the North African desert, beneath an unforgiving sun that seemed to melt not only the metal of the armored vehicles but also the conventional logic of warfare, one man managed to redefine, if only for a moment, the art of war. His name was Erwin Rommel, and his figure emerges between legend and military precision with an almost uncomfortable clarity. They called him the Desert Fox, not out of mere romanticism, but because of the way he moved. Unpredictable, accurate, elusive. Between June and July of 1942, on the seemingly static stage of the Western Desert, Rommel dealt 3 consecutive blows against the British forces in North Africa. 3 maneuvers executed within hours that, at times, tipped the balance in his favor in a war that seemed destined for slowness and repetition. Those 3 strikes, woven as part of a single strategic sequence, left such a deep mark that even today they remain subjects of study, analysis, and unease. The Desert War had its own rules, none resembling what was taught in European military academies. Distances were disproportionate, landmarks changed with the wind, and absolute visibility was both an advantage and a curse. The armies fighting there depended on fragile supply lines, maps that became outdated in a matter of days, and the human will to endure temperatures ranging from unbearable to deadly. In this context, Rommel found fertile ground to deploy his offensive instinct. The first strike occurred on May 26, 1942, in what later became known as the Battle of Gazala. Facing him was the British 8th Army, which had constructed a series of fortified positions between the Gazala line and Tobruk, a kind of wall stretching between the open desert and the Mediterranean coast. The British forces, under General Neil Ritchie, relied on their numerical superiority and the solidity of their positions. Rommel, on the other hand, bet on movement. During the night of the 26th, under a sky covered by a diffuse moon and wind dragging sand like a veil among the vehicles, Rommel launched an enveloping maneuver with most of his armored units. Instead of attacking head-on, he moved around the southern flank in a wide curve that seemed a strategic mistake. But behind this apparent weakness lay exact calculation. The next morning, while the British were still expecting a frontal assault, Rommel was already behind their lines. Chaos was immediate. Communications collapsed, reserves were surprised from the flank, and units began moving without coordination, trapped between enemy fire and their own mined lines. It was a surgical strike, not decisive in absolute terms, but crucial in the collapse of the British command structure. The second strike was almost immediate. Without allowing time for reorganization, Rommel headed south toward Tobruk, knowing that if he captured that city, considered key to British supply in eastern Libya, it would change the entire conflict's outlook. Unlike the long siege the previous year, this time he opted for a rapid, concentrated assault, supported by an unusual combination of artillery, motorized infantry, and Italian tanks that, under his command, operated with unexpected efficiency. On June 20th, after less than 36 hours of fighting, Tobruk fell. It was a lightning victory that left the world speechless. Churchill, who had promised to hold the city at all costs, faced a political crisis. Hitler, meanwhile, rewarded Rommel with a promotion to Field Marshal, making him the first German commander to receive that distinction without having served in the First World War. Propaganda enveloped him in a fog of glory, but for Rommel, the true merit was still to come. The third strike was perhaps the boldest of the 3. Unlike the previous ones, which exploited clear weaknesses in the British lines, this was a preemptive maneuver launched against an enemy already retreating but still capable of reaction. The objective was Egypt, more specifically El Alamein, a narrow point between the sea and the Qatara Depression, a natural bottleneck that could be closed with relatively few forces. If he managed to reach and hold that position, Rommel would open the door to the Suez Canal, toward the heart of the British Empire in the Middle East. Despite the wear on his troops and increasing logistical difficulties, the fuel was starting to run low and supply lines were vulnerable to Allied attacks from Malta. Rommel advanced. He did not wait for orders. He did not request reinforcements. He took advantage of the momentum from the victory at Tobruk and pushed eastward. In a few days, he covered over 600 kilometers across the desert, constantly harassing the retreating British forces. On June 30th, he reached the outskirts of El Alamein, and there, finally, he stopped. Not because he wanted to, because he could not continue. The British defensive line, reassembled under General Claude Auchinleck's command, withstood the initial assault, Over the following weeks, Rommel tried to break through multiple sectors, but he no longer had the momentum, the fuel, or the necessary numbers. The desert, which had so often been his ally, turned against him. The heat increased, sandstorms multiplied, and the enemy began reorganizing with unexpected speed. The third strike was masterful in conception, but failed to achieve its goal. Nevertheless, its audacity left a deep impression on both the enemy and his own troops. What is extraordinary about these three strikes is not only their tactical impact, but the way Rommel executed them, silently, with constant mobility, relying on his commander's initiative and taking risks many considered suicidal. His way of fighting did not follow manuals. It responded to a military intuition honed by experience and a precise reading of the terrain, the moment, and the enemy's morale. He was a master of psychological pressure, and although his victories were not definitive, each forced the Allied High Command to rethink its strategy. In time, the war turned. Rommel was defeated at El Alamein months later, and North Africa ended up under Allied control. But the three strikes he dealt between May and July 1942 continue to be studied as examples of how a commander with vision, speed, and daring can alter the balance of power in an apparently static theater of war. His legacy is uncomfortable. He was a general serving a wrong cause, yet whose tactical skill challenged even the enemies who later respected him. In the desert, where history is erased by the wind, rusty fragments of tanks, shell remnants, and half-buried defensive positions still survive. But in the mental maps of those who study the war, Rommel's three strikes still resonate as a perfect sequence of audacity, intelligence, and calculation. An echo crossing the dunes of time, reminding us that even in the most open spaces, the art of surprise remains one of the most powerful weapons in combat. The lightning at Kursk. The morning of July 12, 1943, did not bring clarity to the Russian sky. The clouds stretched across the horizon like wounds healing poorly, and the air carried that metallic, earthy scent that precedes days of combat, when the ground, the trees, and the bodies seemed to foretell the inevitable. The land around the village of Prokhorovka, southwest of Kursk, vibrated with tension accumulated over weeks. There, in that narrow space where the plains allowed mobility and visibility in equal measure, the greatest tank battle in history was about to unfold. A mechanical and human collision that many still describe as the closest moment to earthly apocalypse witnessed in the 20th century. The Battle of Kursk had officially begun days earlier as a massive German army operation to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. It was Hitler's ultimate gamble, a maneuver intended to cut off the large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk with a double pincer. From the north, with the 9th Army under General Model, and from the south, with the armored divisions of Army Group Center commanded by von Manstein. The objective was clear: to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces inside the salient before they could launch their own offensive. But the German plan had one essential problem. The Soviets already knew it. Red Army intelligence, supported by an effective spy network and meticulous communication interception, knew weeks in advance the main axis of the attack, when it would launch, and with which units. Stalin, for once, listened to his generals, and what they did was monumental. They built the densest defensive line Europe had ever seen. Kilometers of trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, camouflaged artillery positions, staggered firing lines. Everything was prepared not to immediately stop the enemy offensive, but to wear it down, slow it, force it to crash again and again against a wall of fire. And it was precisely in that geometrically precise scenario that the most intense moment of the confrontation would occur. The village of Prokhorovka was a nerve center. It was located right on the route the two SS Panzer Corps needed to cross to complete the southern advance. If that point fell, the encirclement would close. The Germans, aware of its strategic importance, mobilized their most feared units there. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf tank battalions, all veterans, well armed, crewed by soldiers who knew what open field combat was. On the Soviet side, the command did not hesitate. They deployed the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Rotmistrov, a large force but in many ways technologically inferior. The Soviet T-34s were lighter, faster, but also more vulnerable against the long-range guns of the German Tigers and Panthers. And yet, that difference would not define the combat. What happened at Prokhorovka that July 12th was an almost unprecedented phenomenon in military history. From dawn, both forces converged in a limited space, without cover or the possibility of lateral maneuver, turning the battle into a close-range frontal encounter. More than 1,000 tanks faced each other in such a confined space that the cannons could not turn without hitting the hulls of other vehicles. Many fights took place at distances less than 50 meters. There was no time to aim. Shooting first was living one more minute. The ground literally trembled beneath the steel tracks. The smoke from the impacts, the earth raised by explosions, the fire spreading like a glowing tongue across the dry grass, turned the battlefield into a closed hell, where engines roared like wounded beasts and men fired without thinking. For 3 hours, between 8 and 11 in the morning, the combat reached a level of intensity not matched before or after at that scale. In that span, dozens of tanks burned like torches. Shells hit before gunners could confirm their targets. Hatches opened like traps to let crewmen escape engulfed in flames. The Soviets, aware their guns were ineffective at long range, decided to close the distance by force, advancing directly against the German lines, forcing the Tigers to lose their advantage. It was a desperate tactic, suicidal in many cases, but effective. Some Soviet tanks rammed directly into their German counterparts, using mass and speed as their last weapon. The numbers, as often happens in chaotic events, are imprecise. Some sources speak of 600 tanks destroyed in that single day. Others raise the figure to 800. What is certain is that by the end of the day, the fields of Prokhorovka were a steel cemetery, with hundreds of bodies trapped between turrets, and the air so thick with smoke that reconnaissance patrols could not advance without becoming disoriented. The Battle of Kursk did not end there, but that day marked its turning point. The Germans, unable to break the Soviet defenses, began to retreat slowly. The wear had been too great, and for the first time, the strategic initiative definitively passed into the hands of the Red Army. The lightning of Kursk, that precise moment when the armored vehicles charged at each other like cornered animals, was more than a military collision. It was the symbol of a changing era. The war, until then dominated by German mobility and striking power, was beginning to transform into a prolonged offensive of the Soviet world, capable of absorbing blows and returning them multiplied. The defeat at Kursk was a wound for Hitler that would never fully heal. He suspended Operation Citadel, withdrew vital units, and never launched another strategic offensive of that scale in the East. From then on, every German move was an attempt to contain an unstoppable tide. The most unsettling thing of all is that amid the tangle of figures, war reports, and official statements, there remains a silence. The silence of those who were there, inside the tanks, in that strip of land between hills, watching their comrades disappear in a sudden blaze, hearing the sharp impact of a shell against the armor, feeling the heat inside the hull as if hell had been unleashed. Very few survived. Many names were lost forever. But what happened is recorded in the landscape, in collective memory, in the way the history of war is written and studied. Today, the fields of Prokhorovka are marked by monuments that cannot capture the magnitude of that day. Granite columns, bronze plaques, and a bell that rings in memory of the fallen. But there is something more powerful than stone. Memory suspended in time. The echo of a battle that was a lightning bolt of fury, steel, and fire. A lightning bolt that did not illuminate the sky, but the conscience of an entire continent. Because there, at Kursk, under the leaden sky and the ground torn by shrapnel, Europe began to understand that the war would no longer be decided by the tactical genius of a commander, but by the inexorable will of millions advancing as one body, determined never to retreat again. The Phantom Landing, Operation Fortitude. In the art of war, there are battles won with blood and steel, and others, quieter but equally decisive, fought with paper, lies, false signals, and the subtle art of manipulation. World War II, vast as a continent and deep as an open wound, was also the stage for one of the boldest deception campaigns in modern history. Operation Fortitude, the landing that never happened, the phantom invasion that kept German troops waiting for an enemy that never arrived. To understand the scale of this operation, one must go back to the first half of 1944, when the Allies were already determined to cross the English Channel and open the Second Front in Europe. The question was no longer if they would invade France, but where and when they would do so. And it was precisely this uncertainty that British and American intelligence turned into a weapon. Hitler and his general staff were convinced that an attack on the coast was imminent, but geography offered multiple options: Normandy, Brittany, southern France, or the shortest and most logical route, the Strait of Calais. It was there, at that point where the channel narrows and the invasion route seemed most direct, where Hitler expected the full weight of the Allied assault to fall. And it was exactly that expectation that was carefully fed, with a deception operation so sophisticated that even today it remains a subject of analysis for its psychological precision. Operation Fortitude was divided into two parts: Fortitude North, which feigned an invasion of Norway to distract the German northern forces, and Fortitude South, much more elaborate, aimed at convincing the German High Command that the main landing would be at Calais. The latter, the most complex, was carried out with a mix of traditional methods and absolutely innovative resources for its time. It was not just about spreading rumors or forging maps. It was about building a parallel reality with such a level of detail that even the most skeptical of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, accepted it as true. The first step was to create a fictitious army. The first U.S. Army group, known as FUSAG, existed only on paper, on the radio, in military correspondence, and in reconnaissance reports. Its commander was none other than General George S. Patton, whose impulsive, media-savvy, and legendary character made him the perfect choice to lead a real invasion. Patton, in reality, was suspended following a disciplinary incident, but that only fueled the narrative. His supposed triumphant return to command the offensive at Calais sounded plausible. His mere presence in England was enough to create unease in the German High Command. Around him, the Allies built a colossal stage set. Life-sized inflatable tanks and trucks were parked in fields in southern England. Fake cannons made of wood and canvas pointed toward the channel. Even docks, warehouses, and airstrips were constructed solely as decoys, but could be detected by enemy reconnaissance planes. At night, columns of moving lights simulated convoys on the move. During the day, theatrical patrols, formations, and fake training exercises with actors in uniform were organized, all to create the illusion that tens of thousands of men were concentrated in the area, ready to deliver the decisive blow on Calais. But all this would have been useless without a well-woven intelligence network. And this is where the true genius of Fortitude came into play: the manipulation of double agents. Section Waity of MI5, the British Counterintelligence Service, had managed to turn almost all German spies on British soil into undercover collaborators. One of the most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard who, under the codename Garbo, fed the Nazis carefully calibrated information. Credible, useful, but always slightly delayed or redirected. His messages described with meticulous precision the movements of the fictitious FUSAG, the preparations to cross the channel at Calais, and the technical delays that supposedly prevented immediate action. Every letter, every intercepted telegram, every radio frequency was carefully designed to reinforce this idea. The real attack would come through Calais, and any other movement would be a distraction. Even after D-Day, when Allied troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the deception continued. For weeks, Hitler kept several elite divisions stationed near Calais, convinced that the main assault was still to come. That decision, made under the direct influence of Operation Fortitude, allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions in Normandy with less resistance than expected. It was a victory without combat, achieved through the power of illusion. The brilliance of Fortitude lies not only in its technical execution, but also in its moral audacity. The planners knew they were betting on the enemy's mind, on their prejudices, on their fears. They knew they were fabricating a distorted mirror, and trusted that the adversary would get lost in their own reflection. And it worked. It worked to the point that German documents after the landing show how doubt persisted even when the facts were already evident. There was talk of a secondary operation, a smokescreen. The deception had penetrated so deeply that the truth became invisible. Some analysts have suggested that Fortitude was the cleanest battle of the entire war. No deaths on the field, no cannons fired, but its impact was brutal. German decisions, conditioned by a threat that did not exist, saved thousands of Allied lives. They allowed the establishment of a solid beachhead. They gave the necessary margin for the advance toward Paris to begin strongly. And above all, they showed that modern war was no longer defined solely on the battlefields, but also in offices, on radio waves, in encrypted messages crossing the night without leaving a trace. Today, when one walks through the fields where Patton's supposed army was deployed, one finds little more than pastures and some plaques. But if one digs through archives, intelligence reports, and spy correspondence, the silhouette of a ghost marching across Europe unseen emerges. An army of smoke, cardboard, and data. An army that never landed, but changed the course of a war. Because sometimes the most powerful thing is not what is seen, but what is expected to be seen. And in that space between suspicion and certainty, between fiction and strategy, Operation Fortitude drew a master line that diverted history with the invisible weight of a perfect lie. The fog over Omaha. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the sea roared like a wounded beast beneath the hulls of the amphibious transports advancing toward the Normandy coast. There was a heavy moisture in the air, filled not only with salt, but with foreboding, and amid the unresolved shadows of that night, thousands of men prepared to land on a stretch of sand that history would remember by a single name: Omaha. No one could foresee that, among the 5 beaches assigned to D-Day, Omaha would become the bloodiest, the most chaotic, and paradoxically, one of the most decisive. There, failure brushed victory with its fingers, and it was that fog, not only the one floating over the water, but the fog of uncertainty, confusion, and chance that defined the fate of the most ambitious landing of all time. Omaha was bordered by steep cliffs and German fortifications that dominated every meter of the beach. The German divisions defending it were more experienced than expected, better positioned, and more determined than Allied intelligence reports had predicted. What was supposed to be a gradual advance from the coast turned, in a matter of minutes, into a massacre. The naval artillery shells that were meant to pulverize the German defenses before the arrival of ground troops failed in their mission, whether due to miscalculations in targeting, unfavorable weather conditions, or delayed strategic decisions that shortened the bombardment time. When the first Higgins boats dropped their ramps, the American soldiers descended into hell with their rifles still dry and water up to their waists. The fog was not literal in every sense, but it was symbolic. Because at Omaha, more than any other landing sector, command structures broke down, units scattered, and the original plan dissolved into a tide of individual decisions, isolated acts of courage, and desperate improvisations. Radios did not work. Visual signals were useless amid the smoke and dust raised by explosions. Companies mixed together. Officers fell in the first minutes, and sergeants had to take command without maps or clear coordinates. It was a battle fought almost by instinct, by reflex, where every meter gained cost minutes of uninterrupted fire and lives extinguished before firing a single shot. In the first hours, there were moments when it was believed that Omaha would be lost. Reports reaching the command ships were despairing. Some units became paralyzed at the waterline, unable to advance or retreat. The Germans, entrenched in reinforced bunkers, swept the beach with MG-42 machine guns, whose rate of fire was so brutal that the bullets seemed to form an invisible wall. Men threw themselves to the ground, dug with their hands in the wet sand, and used the bodies of their comrades as the only cover. The chaos was absolute. And yet, something happened. What occurred at Omaha was a reaction that military strategy cannot fully plan for, but that changes the course of a battle. The will to survive transformed into collective determination. There was no visible leader inspiring a heroic charge. There was no clear order that reversed the situation. What there was a set of small actions, almost all initiated from below by rank-and-file soldiers and mid-level officers, who began to find gaps in the German defense system. One platoon managed to climb part of the cliff under fire. Another used the smoke from an explosion to infiltrate a machine gun nest. Some engineers dragged improvised explosive charges to the barbed wire. Others ran across open spaces, knowing they might not make it but opening the way for others to follow. In one of the most critical sectors, a group of barely 30 men managed to penetrate the defensive line and open a gap that, throughout the day, would turn into a corridor of advance. It was so narrow, so fragile, that a well-coordinated counterattack could have closed it. But the Germans were also trapped in their own dilemma. Their coastal artillery was beginning to run out of ammunition. Communications with high command were erratic. Many of the officers on the ground did not know if they were facing a secondary landing or the main axis of the invasion. That doubt, planted by Operation Fortitude, still hovered over their decisions. That fog was also on the German side. Around midday, Allied units began establishing firmer positions on the higher ground. The first supply routes from the beach were opened. Radio teams regained connection with the ships. Naval artillery adjusted its fire, this time with better information. And the German resistance, though still fierce, began to fragment. It was a slow, agonizing turn, without cinematic drama, but it was decisive. By sunset, Omaha was in Allied hands, at the cost of more than 3,000 casualties among the dead, wounded, and missing. It was the highest toll among all D-Day beaches, but it was not in vain. The enigma of Omaha lies not only in its ferocity, but in how a situation that for many hours seemed destined for disaster was reversed. Unlike other fronts, where operations could be adjusted on the fly with some margin, Omaha was for hours a blind fight, where unpredictability reigned and every decision had immediate consequences. And yet, it was that very chaos that allowed flexibility, the space for small individual initiatives to find cracks in the enemy's strategy. It was the moment when war ceased to be directed from desks and maps and began to depend on decisions made at ground level, amid explosions, shouts, and the constant sound of the waves. Today, Omaha Beach is a serene place, with the sea gently washing over the sand where once lay scattered bodies, twisted metal, and blood puddles diluted by foam. The monuments stand there as anchors of memory, but the true echo of that battle lives in the conceptual fog that enveloped it, in the bewilderment, in the confusion that could not be anticipated, and in how chaos can sometimes be overcome not by order, but by persistent, irrational human courage. At Omaha, it was not a perfect strategy that triumphed. It was endurance, determination, the ability to advance when all signs indicated that retreat was the only rational option. And that victory, born from the fog, was the one that opened the way to Europe, changed the rhythm of the war, and forever marked the map of history. The silence in the Hürtgen forest, The Hürtgen forest does not stand out in the memory of the Second World War with the spectacular nature of Normandy, nor with the symbolic resonance of Stalingrad, and yet, among its dense trees and shadowy paths, one of the longest, most futile, and most desolate campaigns of the entire conflict was fought. Unlike other battles that changed the course of the war within hours or days, Hürtgen spread like a persistent disease between September 1944 and February 1945, swallowing entire divisions in a nightmare of mud, hidden mines, ambushes, and harsh weather. What was meant to be a tactical advance operation at the western edge of the Reich ended up becoming a trap where time seemed to have stopped and military logic dissolved beneath the fog and damp leaves. The forest, located in the border region between Germany and Belgium, stretched like a compact hostile mass, with steep hills, invisible ravines, and vegetation so thick that visibility was reduced to only a few meters even in broad daylight. There, the United States Army faced entrenched German forces determined to defend every tree trunk as if it were a wall. It was not a great battle in terms of movement or bold maneuvers. It was, rather, a war of positions anchored in an environment seemingly designed to multiply suffering. The rain turned trails into impassable mud pits. The cold paralyzed fingers before they could pull the trigger, and every step could mean the sudden explosion of a hidden anti-personnel mine buried among the roots. The most disturbing aspect of the Hürtgen forest is that from its early days, it already seemed clear that the effort would not justify the cost. The objective was to secure a series of hydroelectric dams on the Roer River, prevent the Germans from flooding the valleys, and guarantee the army's passage to the heart of the Reich. But those goals, which appeared logical on the map, were almost impossible in the field. Every advance of a few hundred meters cost entire days of combat, dozens of lives, and logistics that constantly collapsed due to bad weather and German artillery fire. Often, positions were gained and lost on the same day. They fought over unnamed numbered hills, forest clearings that appeared in no reports, and dirt roads leading nowhere. The Germans, who knew the terrain as if they had carved it with their own hands, exploited every natural advantage. They used snipers hidden in the branches, placed explosive traps in hollow trees, and camouflaged themselves with an effectiveness bordering on the ghostly. Even when they retreated, they left behind minefields and delayed devices that turned victories into new sources of casualties. The enemy did not need large offensives. It was enough to wait, hide, and strike at the exact moment. Every shot seemed to come from the forest itself, as if the entire environment had allied with the German defense. The American soldiers, mostly young men who had never experienced anything like this, were plunged into an experience bordering on the absurd. Communications were impossible, maps were inaccurate or useless, and morale dissolved with every night of cold and fear. There was no visible glory or heroism, only exhaustion, confusion, and a slow, interrupted advance measured more in bodies than in kilometers. Many testimonies describe how the forest seemed to whisper at night, how the wind among the branches sounded like lost voices, like echoes of comrades who never returned. That silence was not the absence of noise. It was a presence in itself, thick, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. In one of the most representative episodes of that campaign, the attack on Hill 400 near the town of Bergstein became a senseless hell. The hill offered a strategic view over the valley, and Allied commanders considered it key to securing the flank of the advance. What followed was a series of failed attempts to take the position, with entire companies trapped in crossfire, unable to evacuate, surrounded by invisible enemies. Even when the summit was finally taken, German counterattacks turned it into an open prison where control was symbolic, but punishment constant. Nothing was definitive in Hürtgen. Everything was temporary, and that temporariness cost lives. As weeks turned into months, the campaign began to fade from newspaper headlines. Attention focused on the Soviet offensive in the east, on bombings over German cities, on preparations for crossing the Rhine. But in Hürtgen, the horror continued unabated. When the operation finally ended, the numbers spoke for themselves. More than 30,000 Allied casualties, not counting psychological wounds, not counting those who returned with empty stares, unable to explain exactly what happened in that green labyrinth. German casualties were lower, and although the terrain was eventually ceded, it was not decisive in stopping the Allied advance into the interior of Germany. And here is where the mystery deepens. Because Hürtgen was not a victory, but it was not a clear defeat either. It was a kind of war limbo, a region suspended in history where more was lost than gained. Some argue the campaign was a strategic mistake from the start, insisted upon out of stubbornness, pride, or pressure to show results before winter. Others claim that although the cost was excessive, it prevented the Germans from consolidating a defense line further west. But even in tactical explanations, the feeling lingers that in Hürtgen, the war became unnecessarily cruel, unnecessarily silent. Today, the forest has closed its scars again. Vegetation has covered the trenches, roots have pierced abandoned bunkers, and the light filtering through the treetops seems to ignore what happened under its shadow. But those who walk there with open eyes can still feel that density. They can still imagine figures moving in the mist. They can still perceive the echo of an isolated shot, the crack of a broken branch, the held breath of someone who never knew if they would live to see another dawn. The silence of the Hürtgen forest remains one of the most unsettling chapters of the Second World War. Not because it defined a great victory, but because it reveals the darkest and most enigmatic side of the conflict. The place where war strips itself of epicness, where heroism is replaced by persistence, and where history seems to resist being told. In that forest, what remained was not a monument, nor a glorious date. What remained was a void, and that void even today seems to watch whoever mentions it. The Ardennes Gap. The early morning of December 16, 1944, began with a deep crunch beneath the frozen trees of the Ardennes, a crunch not caused by the wind or frost, but by metal. It was the rough sound of hundreds of German tanks moving in unison along the forest paths of a region that, on the surface, held no strategic value in the midst of winter. The Allied soldiers stationed on the front line believed they were entering a period of relative calm, the prelude to a Christmas that might, with luck, be the last of the war. What they did not know was that at that very moment, Hitler was launching his last great offensive on the Western Front. A maneuver as bold as it was desperate, aimed at tearing through the Allied lines and changing the course of a war that was already slipping from his grasp. The chosen battlefield was not new. The Ardennes had already been used by the Germans at the beginning of the conflict to penetrate France through a weak flank, bypassing the fortifications of the Maginot Line. And now, 5 years later, the German High Command was betting again on the same strategy, trusting that the rugged terrain, narrow roads, and adverse weather would play in their favor. The objective was clear and brutal: to open a massive breach in the Allied defenses, divide the British and American armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and thereby paralyze Allied supplies in Western Europe. If successful, the Western Front would fragment, negotiations could be forced, and the war, at least in the West, might tilt toward a peace favorable to Germany. But it was not only the terrain that became a major player. Hitler's great ally was the fog. During the first days of the offensive, a thick layer of fog covered the region, preventing the Allied aircraft, which until then had dominated the skies unchallenged, from intervening. This advantage allowed the panzer divisions to advance with devastating force, taking entire units by surprise who did not expect an attack of that magnitude, and creating such absolute chaos that in many parts of the front the lines dissolved with hardly any organized resistance. The surprise was total. The first waves of attack fell on American positions that were not prepared for an assault of that scale. In hours, entire towns changed hands. Roads that had previously been supply routes turned into corridors of fire. Some units, like the 106th Infantry Regiment, were practically annihilated. The German advance was swift, fierce, determined. The figure of Otto Skorzeny, the charismatic and feared commander of the Waffen-SS, became central in this stage. Under his direction, commandos disguised in Allied uniforms sabotaged communication lines, confused troops, manipulated traffic signals, and spread false information, causing panic and paranoia in the rear. Within days, there was talk of spies everywhere, infiltrated vehicles, internal betrayals. It was a psychological war as effective as the gunfire. And yet, amid the whirlwind of the attack, episodes of resistance emerged that would end up making a difference. The most iconic was the defense of Bastogne, a vital crossroads the Germans needed to control to sustain the momentum of their advance. There, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded for days, with no possibility of reinforcements, suffering extreme weather conditions, no heating, insufficient ammunition, and food supplies. But they resisted. And when the German commander sent a formal demand for surrender, he received only one word in response, a word that became a symbol: nuts, which in soldier slang was an emphatic, almost mocking challenge, a blunt way of saying they preferred to freeze to death rather than surrender. That kind of gesture, beyond cinematic heroism, had a multiplying effect. The troops that began to regroup understood that the German advance, impressive as it was not invincible. Furthermore, the weather, which had initially favored the attackers, began to change. The fog lifted, and when the skies cleared again, the Allied Air Force became an unrelenting hammer. Entire convoys were destroyed from the air. The already precarious German supply routes collapsed under the bombs. Fuel began to run short, and the tanks, designed for a swift offensive, became trapped, without mobility or protection. The Ardennes Gap opened with brutal force, but over the days it began to close from within. The German plan, overly ambitious, depended on a speed that vanished and on logistical support that was never sufficient. When the Allied units reorganized their defenses and began the counterattack, the Germans found themselves in an unsustainable situation. And despite the losses, despite the cold, the mud, and initial doubts, the Allies not only stopped the offensive, but recovered lost ground and continued their advance toward the Rhine. Tactically, the Battle of the Ardennes was the last large-scale German offensive on the Western Front. Humanly, it was a heartbreaking reminder that war was still capable of reinventing horror, even when it seemed exhausted. More than 80,000 American casualties. Nearly 100,000 on the German side. Civilians trapped between lines. Entire towns razed. And a region, the Ardennes, left marked by a roar so intense that the entire winter seemed frozen in a single moment of combat. But the most disturbing aspect of the Ardennes Gap was not its military outcome. What was truly unsettling was the revelation that the enemy, still cornered, still surrounded, still doomed, was capable of delivering a blow that shook every foundation. The idea of a one war was suspended. The conflict could still take unexpected turns, rise from the frozen ground like a shadow that does not extinguish. That possibility of the unforeseen is what gives this battle a profoundly enigmatic dimension. Today, among the forests that witnessed the advance and retreat, rusty shell casings, trench footprints, and fragments of vehicles covered in moss can still be found. History has resumed its course, but some who walk those winter trails swear there is something suspended in the air. An echo of engines that never quite arrives, a metallic murmur that seems to rise from the earth, as if the gap in reality had never fully closed, as if a crack in time still remained open, through which every so often a whisper of the war escapes. The Remagen Bridge. At the beginning of March 1945, while the Third Reich was slowly collapsing from within and without, something unexpected happened in a forgotten corner of Western Germany. What began as a simple reconnaissance maneuver ended up becoming one of the most symbolic episodes of the Nazi collapse and, at the same time, a feat so unlikely it seems written by the most whimsical chance of war. It was there, in the quiet town of Remagen, where an old steel railway bridge still stood, crossing the wide and turbulent Rhine River. No one imagined that this crossing, modest in appearance and forgotten by most strategists, would become the gateway for the Allied army into the heart of Germany. As the American troops advanced with overwhelming force from the west, following the breakthrough of the front in the Ardennes, the Allied commanders knew that the next great natural obstacle to overcome was the Rhine, a deep, fast and wide river that stretched like a natural barrier on the German military map. The German High Command considered it the last real defensive line before enemy armies set foot on the industrial and political heart of the Reich. For that reason, all the bridges along the Rhine had been, one after another, demolished by the retreating German troops in a scorched earth strategy aimed at delaying the inevitable by days or weeks. What the Allies did not know, and the Germans had yet to fully resolve, was that in Remagen the Ludendorff Bridge, named in honor of the World War I general, was still standing. It was a reinforced railway bridge, originally built to move supplies during the First World War, and had survived, due to a mix of neglect and desperation, the massive destruction orders that Hitler had issued in his final days. Although it had already been rigged with explosives and the structure showed visible damage, the German engineers had failed to destroy it completely. And when the vanguard of the American 9th Armored Division, under the command of Colonel Leonard Engelmann, reached the hill overlooking Remagen and saw the bridge still standing amidst smoke and explosions, they realized they had before them a unique opportunity. Instead of waiting for orders from high command, the colonel made a decision as reckless as it was historic: to cross, quickly, without hesitation, without waiting for reinforcements, without consulting anyone. He ordered the advance. He did it because he knew that within minutes the bridge could explode. Every second counted. What followed was an operation of daring, ingenuity, and nerves of steel. The first units ran across, under machine gun fire and mortar shells, over the damaged planks of the bridge, with the constant feeling that at any moment, all the metal beneath their feet would collapse into the icy water of the Rhine. The tension was so unbearable that many soldiers preferred to run without looking down, guided by the idea that the bridge could blow up with every step. On the German side, confusion was palpable. The charges placed on the pillars had been activated as soon as the Americans appeared on the horizon, but the explosion did not have the expected effect. Part of the bridge shook. Sections of the structure cracked, but it did not collapse. The detonation system was old, defective, and some cables were poorly connected. The result was a disaster for the German defense. The bridge, though damaged, remained passable. And worse still, the Americans lost no time. Within hours, engineer units began reinforcing it, building side walkways, shoring up the structure with wood, steel, and determination. The news arrived like a thunderstorm at Hitler's headquarters. Upon learning that a bridge over the Rhine had fallen intact into enemy hands, the dictator erupted in fury and ordered a series of immediate reprisals. The general who should have destroyed the bridge was arrested, tried, and executed within days. Bombing squadrons were sent to destroy it from the air. Commandos were deployed on suicide missions to infiltrate by the river and place explosives. Even revolutionary V-2 missiles, designed more for terror than tactical precision, were launched. Nothing worked. Every night, German bombers flew over Remagen trying to reduce the symbol of the Allied advance to rubble. Every day, American engineers repaired the damage with near miraculous speed, replacing beams and planks, keeping open a vital passage for tanks, trucks, fresh troops, and communication equipment to cross. The bridge, wounded but still alive, became the emblem of a war that no longer obeyed strategic logic, but pure stubbornness. And as the attacks continued, the crossing at Remagen changed the course of the Allied offensive. Instead of preparing a complex and costly assault on the Rhine, which would have required weeks of planning and the construction of pontoon bridges under enemy fire, the Americans now had a direct and real access to the interior of Germany. In less than a week, tens of thousands of soldiers were already on the other side of the river. Thus, a new front was opened from the west, deeper, faster, and closer to the Reich's own capital. The Ludendorff Bridge, however, did not survive much longer. On March 11th, after days of tension, repairs, and attacks, the structure finally collapsed. It was not due to a bomb, but to the accumulated wear and the constant strain it had been subjected to. Several soldiers died at the moment of the collapse, but it was already too late for the Germans. The crossing had been established, and Allied engineers had already built pontoon bridges further south, using the time Remagen had given them. The true value of the Remagen Bridge is not measured in kilometers gained, nor even in the direct impact on the final outcome of the war, which at that point was a matter of months. What makes it an essential and mysterious chapter of the conflict is the chain of coincidences that kept it standing just long enough. The failure of a detonation, the bold decision of a colonel, the improvised resistance of engineers under fire, and a structure that, against all logic, did not collapse on the first or second attempt. All this happened in just days, but its echo lasted for decades. Today, the remains of the bridge no longer exist, but the memory persists. On the Rhine's bank, some claim that on certain damp spring nights, a distant metallic creaking can be heard, as if an invisible structure still vibrated over the water. Some believe it is the wind among the hills. Others say it is the memory of the war making time creak. The truth is that in Remagen, where the deepest river in Europe was crossed when no one expected it, the moment when the fate of a continent tilted on a crack in strategy still lingers. A moment of iron, smoke, and will. A moment when chance, disguised as decision, opened a door that would never close again. The Battle of Berlin, entry to the Reichstag. When the spring of 1945 reached Europe, it brought with it a smell of ash, wet cement, and resignation. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, had become an open wound, more a symbol than a military objective. The Soviet army advanced from the east like an iron wave that did not retreat. In the city streets, the empty speeches of the Third Reich still echoed, although no one listened anymore. Reality had imposed itself with the harshness of demolition. The war was lost for Germany, but the final act remained, the fall. And on that last stage, a building emerged like a spectral figure, full of meaning, propaganda, and suspended history, the Reichstag. The battle for Berlin was much more than a military operation. It was a final dance of desperation and revenge, a confrontation between two exhausted but determined forces, who knew that in that city not only the end of a war would be defined, but the beginning of a new era. On one side, the Soviet troops, hardened by years of combat, driven by a mixture of accumulated hatred and the need for redemption after the German invasion of 1941. On the other, what was left of the Wehrmacht, young recruits, old fighters, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth wielding weapons with trembling hands and hearts full of broken lies. The entry into Berlin was not immediate. The advance was slow, bloody, inch by inch. Marshal Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, led the main push, while Konev, from the south, pressured with calculated speed. Despite the Soviet firepower, the Germans turned every corner, every basement, every building into a small fortress. Urban combat became a repetitive torture, a bleeding puzzle trying to be solved. Armored units were almost useless in the narrow alleys. German snipers, expert and silent, turned broken windows into deadly traps. The subway tunnels were used as escape routes, but also as ambush sites. It was a city defended not by strategy, but by inertia, by the stubborn denial of its end. And at the heart of it all, in the center of that bombed labyrinth, stood the Reichstag. Although the building had no real political use since the 1933 fire, its symbolic weight was immense. For the Soviets, it represented the core of Nazism, the empty temple of an ideology that had ravaged their lands. For Hitler and his officers, the building was just stone, but the possibility of it falling into enemy hands was still intolerable. Hence arose one of the most terrible ironies of the conflict. Defending tooth and nail a place that no longer represented anything functional, but whose symbolic value was enough to turn it into a fortress. The fights around the Reichstag began in the last days of April. Soviet forces had already penetrated the city center, and the only thing standing between them and the building was the Spree River, whose banks were full of defensive positions. Artillery had turned the sky into a constant symphony of booms. Smoke covered everything. And when soldiers of the 150th Rifle Regiment, led by Vasily Shatayev and Mikhail Minin, managed to approach the Reichstag steps, they knew they were entering a place that did not belong to the logic of war, but to the liturgy of victory. Inside the building, the defenses were crude but effective. The internal columns were full of embedded shrapnel. Every room had been reinforced with sandbags. Every corridor turned into a shooting gallery. The fighting was so close that shots were fired at point-blank range, with no time to aim, no space to think. There were no flanks or rear guards, only enemies, smoke and rubble. The Reichstag became a purgatory of fire and dust. For almost 2 days, fighting continued within its blackened walls. On the roofs, balconies, and broken staircases, soldiers fought with the urgency of those who know that what is at stake is not only a position, but the image of surrender. At dusk, on April 30th, while in another part of the city, Hitler took his own life in his bunker. The Soviets achieved what had become a propaganda objective, raising their flag over the Reichstag. The famous image of the red flag waving over the ruins of the building was taken shortly after, although the photograph that traveled the world was staged the following day to ensure a good shot. The gesture was real, powerful, and final. The war in Europe did not end that day, but the Reich collapsed at that moment, when its capital burned, its symbols were occupied, and its future was decided by those coming from the east, not from within. The unsettling aspect of the Battle of the Reichstag does not lie in its outcome, which was already a foregone conclusion. The truly mysterious thing is how that place, a hollow shell, destroyed years before, forgotten in the corridors of power, recovered in those hours its capacity to represent. To gather in one place the passions, fears, glory, and horror of a total war. It was a battle for an image, for a narrative. The Soviets wanted that flag there not for tactical necessity, but because they knew that symbol would travel farther than any column of tanks. And so it was. The photograph of the red banner flying atop the Reichstag not only represented the end of the Nazi regime, it was the promise of a new order, one where the Soviet Union would rise as a superpower, as a victor, as a liberator, at least according to its own version. For many, that image seals the century, an image that, like all powerful things, is half truth and half story. Today, the rebuilt Reichstag is the home of the modern German parliament. Its glass dome allows people to see the sessions from above, as if the new country were being built in full view of all. But the building has not forgotten what it lived through. On its walls, one can still read inscriptions carved by Soviet soldiers at the end of the war. Names, dates, clumsy phrases written with charcoal or knives. Messages that cross decades and survive as whispers of a battle fought for control of a symbol. The echo of that final entry, among gunfire and ruins, remains one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. Because at that moment, atop a building that no longer had a function, rose the weight of a history that would end with the fall of Berlin and begin with the division of the world. It was there, between stone and smoke, that a war ended, and another began. The Secret of Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the sky over the Japanese city of Hiroshima was blue, clear, and without any threat. The sun was beginning to warm the rooftops. Bicycles moved through the streets as every morning, and in the markets, the murmur was the usual one. No one knew that in the sky, more than 9,000 meters above, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay was advancing with a load unlike anything humanity had ever known. It was not a common bomb, nor just another in the long list of air attacks that Japan had already suffered. It was a decision, a break, a warning, and a coded message to the entire world. What happened seconds later changed history. But the true mystery of Hiroshima is not only in the explosion that destroyed a city in an instant. The secret lies in everything surrounding that moment. In the prior decisions, in the hidden rehearsals, in the code names, in the silences maintained for years, in the redacted documents, in the shadows still cast when speaking about that morning. Because Hiroshima was not just a bomb, it was the birth of a new era. And like every birth that begins with a wound, it is surrounded by questions that have not finished healing. The weapon that exploded over Hiroshima had an innocent and almost cruelly ironic name: Little Boy. The device, which released energy equivalent to more than 15,000 tons of TNT, had been the result of one of the most secret and ambitious scientific projects in history: the Manhattan Project. For years, in the New Mexico desert, dozens of physicists, mathematicians, engineers, and military personnel worked in complete isolation to develop a definitive weapon, something that could stop the war, absolutely. What many of those scientists did not know was that their invention, once perfected, would not be dropped on a conventional military target, but on a living city, with hospitals, temples, schools, trams, and parks. Hiroshima was chosen among several possible candidate cities. Kyoto was discarded, it is said, because an advisor to President Truman had honeymooned there and remembered it fondly. Tokyo was already devastated. Hiroshima, on the other hand, had remained almost intact during the war. It was, to put it in a cruel way, a blank canvas to precisely evaluate the effects of an atomic bomb. The strategists wanted to see the exact range, the real power, without interference. A city without marks of previous bombings, with sufficient urban density, surrounded by hills that would enhance the blast wave's effect. That was the logic. That was how it was decided. The explosion, as we know it today, was only the beginning. The blast wave destroyed the city in less than a second. Buildings crumbled in cascades of dust and fire. People at the epicenter were reduced to shadows etched on walls. The heat was so intense that steel bent as if it were paper. But the most disconcerting was the silence afterward. Hiroshima did not roar. Hiroshima disappeared wrapped in a white glow that made no noise, as if the city had been absorbed by a void. The testimonies of the few survivors agree that the minutes afterward were unrealistically calm, as if the world was holding its breath. For weeks, no one really knew what had happened. Japan issued ambiguous statements. The United States remained silent. People spoke of a new bomb, but no one could imagine the scale of the catastrophe. Not even the Manhattan Project scientists, many of whom were horrified when they learned the real impact. The Japanese authorities did not immediately understand that it was a nuclear weapon. Only when reports about radiation began to arrive, about bodies continuing to die without visible wounds, about skin peeling off on contact, did they start to comprehend that what had fallen on Hiroshima was not of this earth. What still puzzles today is the way information was managed. For years, medical reports on the bomb's effects were censored. Field studies, conducted by Japanese scientists, were confiscated by the Americans. Photographs of charred bodies, collapsed structures, survivors with deformed faces, took decades to become public. Hiroshima became an open secret, a city everyone knew existed, but whose pain was deliberately hidden. Why? Why did the country that dropped the bomb want, for so long, to deny its real effects? One of the answers lies in the symbolic dimension of the act. The atomic bomb was not only a weapon, it was a message directed at the rest of the world. In particular to the Soviet Union, which had already begun to position itself as a future power in the post-war division. Showing atomic power in a Japanese city was not only a military decision, it was a declaration of technological, political, and strategic supremacy. Hiroshima was, in that sense, the first shot of the Cold War. And for that shot to be effective, it had to be seen as something clean, necessary, even inevitable. Showing the charred bodies, radiation sickness, devastating psychological effects would have ruined that narrative. But the mystery goes beyond politics. Some hold that Hiroshima was not only a strategic experiment, but also a scientific one. That, deep down, it was about observing in real time the effects of a new type of weapon on an entire population. That the subsequent reports, the analysis of heat propagation, radiation levels, structural collapse, were studied as if the city had been a human-scale laboratory. It is a disturbing theory, difficult to confirm, but one that resonates strongly every time classified documents with precise calculations on the behavior of the target are discovered. And yet, Hiroshima remained standing, not as a city at first, but as a symbol. Despite being erased in seconds, it rose again. The people who survived, known as hibakusha, lived with indelible physical and emotional scars, but also with a dignity that defied time. Every year on the anniversary of the bomb, the Peace Memorial Park fills with floating lanterns, prayers, and silence. It is not just about remembering. It is about resisting oblivion, about not allowing history to become just another statistic. Today, Hiroshima is a modern, vibrant city with fast trains and glass buildings. But if one walks its streets attentively, cracks can still be seen. Some are in the walls, others in the eyes of the elderly. And if one stops in front of the atomic bomb dome, the skeletal structure that withstood the explosion, one will feel that building is more than a ruin. It is a warning, not about the past, about the future. Because the real secret of Hiroshima is not only what happened that day, it is in what came afterward, in what was chosen to be silenced, in what continues to be debated beneath layers of classified reports, in what humanity decided to do with that door it opened and could never fully close again. A secret that still burns, not in the ruins, but in the collective conscience. In the question that, although not spoken aloud, remains there, suspended between the ashes of August and the decisions of every generation. What if it happens again? The surrender, the silence in Tokyo Bay. The morning of September 2nd, 1945, brought no explosions nor gunfire. For the first time in years, the world held its breath without the roar of artillery as a backdrop. The sea, calm, reflected a sky heavy with clouds and omens. In the vast Tokyo Bay, the American battleship USS Missouri floated like a steel island among dozens of Allied ships. On its deck, there were no soldiers ready for battle nor cannons aimed at the coast. There were papers, tables, pens, ironed uniforms, and a silence so dense it seemed to belong to another planet. That day, the world witnessed the official closure of the Second World War. It was the final act of a global tragedy that had left more than 70 million dead, cities reduced to dust, broken civilizations, and humanity marked by wounds that would not heal for generations. But what happened during that surrender ceremony was much more than a formal gesture. It was a precise choreography, planned down to the last detail to convey power, to restore order, to define the narrative of victory and the future. And among all that, what resonated most was not the speech, nor the uniforms, nor the signatures on the treaty. It was the silence. That silence suspended over the sea when the Japanese Empire knelt without a single shot fired. The choice of location was no accident. The USS Missouri, named in honor of the home state of President Harry S. Truman, was a floating fortress, a symbol of American military might. There, on its deck, flags were raised, officers from multiple nations aligned: Great Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Australia, France, New Zealand, Canada, and the Netherlands. And a simple table was set with 2 copies of the surrender document. Facing them, the Japanese delegates stepped forward, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu. They walked with the stiffness of those who knew they carried the humiliation of an entire empire on their shoulders. The images from that day have traveled the world as emblems of official history, but there are details that cannot be seen, heard, or recorded in reports. No one describes, for example, the palpable tension on the ship's deck, the way those present avoided looking too long into each other's eyes, the manner in which words seemed unnecessary. The act itself lasted less than half an hour. Yet, in that brief moment, the end of one era and the beginning of another were compressed. The war was over, but peace was not a fact. It was barely a promise written in black ink on white paper, signed by men who knew the hardest part was still to come. When General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, spoke, he did so with a deep, restrained voice, aware of his historic role. There was no euphoria nor triumphant phrases, only a sober, measured declaration that spoke of hope, reconstruction, and justice. Because even for the victor, victory tasted bitterly of the irreparable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki still smoked in memory. The images of battlefields, prisoners, orphaned children, civilians massacred on the Pacific Islands were too recent to celebrate. The signing of the document was performed with ritual solemnity. The Japanese bowed, signed with slow, almost ceremonial gestures. Each signature was more than a stroke. It was an acceptance of the end, an acknowledgement that the sun of the empire, that sun which according to their mythology would never set, had finally fallen below the horizon. Behind them, one by one, the Allied representatives signed on behalf of their countries. Some did so firmly, others with apparent reluctance, as if sensing that the true conclusion of the war was yet to be written. In the years of occupation, in the trials, in the emerging geopolitics. And while the documents were being signed, the sailors of the Missouri, in perfect formation, watched silently. In the distance, Allied ships sounded their sirens like a muted lament. There were no fireworks, no salutes, no cheers, because peace after so much horror was not celebrated. It was received like someone finally finding the end of suffering, knowing that joy was still far away. Japan's surrender was more than a defeat. It was the death of an idea, that of an empire that believed itself sacred, invincible, eternal. It was also the first time an entire nation, destroyed by nuclear power, faced the need to rebuild from ashes. And in that process, a disturbing paradox began to take shape. The victors would become occupiers, and the defeated, strategic allies. History would take another turn. MacArthur would remain in Japan, overseeing the drafting of a new constitution. Emperor Hirohito, despite many demands, would not be judged. The war, which seemed to have ended clearly, left behind a thick fog of difficult decisions, ethical dilemmas, and silences that would last for decades. That day in Tokyo Bay, what was signed was not only the end of the war. It was also the beginning of the atomic age, the Cold War. a world divided into blocks that already eyed each other with suspicion, while echoes of the conflict still reverberated. On that steel deck, the men who signed knew they were marking the close of a brutal chapter. What they did not know was that they were unknowingly writing the first lines of the next. Today, at that same point in the ocean, the water flows as if nothing had happened. But those who have visited the Missouri, now a floating museum, claim there is something on its deck that still weighs, that the air there is thicker, that when stepping on the exact spot where the surrender was signed, the world seems to pause for a moment. It is as if the memory of that moment, that instant suspended between war and peace, has never left the wood of the deck, as if the silence of the bay had never completely gone away. Because what ended that day was not just a war. It was the innocence of the century. It was the idea that horror had limits. It was the last breath of a world that would never be the same again. And that breath, that silence over the water, still floats there, waiting to be heard again. If this made you feel something, anger, awe, unease, write it down. This channel is made for those who are not satisfied with the official version. Subscribe, and keep diving with me into the depths of mysteries that history refuses to release. Good night.